His voice, a low tremor against the rumble of the storm outside, cut through the silence that had defined my existence for months. "Tell me something, Rakim Wu," he said, his breath ghosting against my skin as he turned me to face him. "If I'd been different from the start, if I'd tried, would you have tried too?" The question hung between us, heavier than the rain-soaked air. A desperate plea from a man who had only ever shown me the cutting edge of his indifference. His eyes, usually as cold and distant as the city lights flickering below, were now a storm of their own, mirroring the tempest outside and the one that had been raging inside my own heart. But to understand how we arrived at that moment on that balcony, balanced on the knife's edge of what we were and what we could be, you have to understand the silence that came before it. You have to understand the oppressive, soul-crushing quiet of the Parkman mansion. The first thing that struck me when I stepped across its threshold wasn't the opulence, though it was staggering. It wasn't the gleam of the marble floors that reflected a distorted, smaller version of myself, nor the faint, aristocratic scent of sandalwood and old money that clung to the air. It was the quiet. It was a sepulchral silence, the kind that doesn't bring peace but instead presses down on you. A physical weight that constricts your lungs until you forget the simple rhythm of breathing. The towering walls seemed engineered to diminish me, a constant, architectural reminder of my place in this new life. And I felt it keenly. Since the moment my signature dried on the marriage contract, I had felt myself shrinking, becoming a fragile, temporary ornament in the grand, desolate museum of someone else's life. My name is Rakim Wu. I am or was 25 years old, an Omega, and an online or for a literary journal. According to my mother, I was the luckiest man alive. She'd wept at the wedding, a small, sterile affair in a courthouse office, her hands clutching mine with a desperate strength. "At least you'll be safe now, my Wua," she had whispered, her tears tracing paths through her makeup. "He's an alpha. He will protect you." But protection had never felt so much like a prison. Safety had never tasted so much like ashes. That first evening, the illusion of a real marriage shattered before it had even formed. "Mr. Parkman will not be returning tonight," the head housekeeper informed me with a polite, impersonal bow. "He has urgent business with the company." I manufactured a smile, a brittle thing I was sure she could see right through, pretending this wasn't the exact outcome I had anticipated. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure who the sentiment was for. Perhaps it was for the universe, for so swiftly confirming what I already knew in my bones. This was not a union of hearts. It wasn't even a distant cousin to affection. This arranged marriage was a transaction cold and clinical. My family's small, beloved publishing house, a legacy of 3 generations, had been teetering on the brink of financial ruin. In exchange for its salvation, I became the legal spouse of the enigmatic CEO, Parkman. He required an Omega to complete his public persona, a stable, responsible family man, a safe bet for cautious investors. And I required a lifeline to keep my family from drowning. It was a fair trade on paper. I was told he had a son, Moon, 5 years old. A quiet, peculiar child who had lost his mother in an accident years prior. The topic was a black hole in the family's history. No one dared approach it. Not his father, not the legion of staff who moved like ghosts through the cavernous halls, and not even the voracious tabloids that perpetually orbited the Park family, hungry for any scrap of scandal. That night, I unpacked my meager belongings in the suffocating silence of what was now my bedroom. My side of the colossal wardrobe was immaculate, sterile, as if it had been waiting for a ghost to occupy it. On the other side hung Parkman's suits, a regiment of dark, expensive fabrics arranged with a chilling precision by color and season. They were as impersonal as the man himself. My fingers, acting of their own accord, reached out to touch the lapel of a charcoal gray jacket. The wool was impossibly smooth, cool beneath my touch. A faint scent rose from it, dark roast coffee, sharp cedar, and something else, something intangible and potent, the scent of power. My own reflection caught me by surprise in the full-length mirror. The stranger stared back. A pale, drawn young man with features that seemed too delicate for this harsh new reality. His eyes were wide with a kind of hunted exhaustion. His lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. My hair, still damp from a shower, clung to my forehead in dark strands. I looked less like a husband and more like a boy playing a desperate game of dress-up. A quiet, humorless laugh escaped my lips. It was a broken sound, quickly swallowed by the cavernous room. The next morning brought my first encounter with Moon. He was a small, solemn figure standing by the breakfast table, his tiny hands clutching a well-loved stuffed bear as if it were a shield. His hair was a chaotic tumble of soft black, and his eyes, large and dark like his father's, held a weariness that didn't belong on a child's face. He simply stared at me, wrapped in the same impenetrable silence his father wore like a suit of armor. "Good morning," I offered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I tried for a casual, disarming tone. "You must be Moon." Silence. Not a flicker of acknowledgement. I crouched down to his level, trying again.
I'm Rakim Vu.
"I'll be living here from now on. I believe your father mentioned I was coming." He blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. Then, he turned his back on me, dragging his bear to the far side of the vast dining room, creating a universe of distance between us. I forced a smile, though a small, sharp sting pierced my chest. "That's all right," I said to his retreating back. "I wasn't a big fan of strangers when I was your age, either." The housekeeper, ever-present and silent, materialized at my elbow. "He doesn't speak much, sir," she whispered, her tone apologetic. "Please don't take it personally." I nodded, but of course I did. How could I not? The days bled into weeks, each one a carbon copy of the last. Parkman was a phantom in his own home. He would be gone for days on business trips, or he would return only for a quick shower and a change of suit before disappearing back into the city's concrete maw. On the rare occasions he was present, his aura filled the house like a coming storm. The very air grew tense, charged with an unspoken energy. The staff moved with an even greater caution, their spines straighter, their breathing shallower. He was, I had to admit, breathtakingly beautiful. It was a severe, intimidating kind of beauty, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp, aristocratic features and those dark, piercing eyes that could halt a person mid-sentence. When our paths crossed in the long hallways, his gaze would slide past me as if I were just another piece of expensive, inanimate decor. "Good evening," I would sometimes force myself to say, the polite smile feeling like a mask. His only reply, if any, was a non-committal grunt. A single, clipped syllable, devoid of any warmth. And yet, my treacherous heart would betray me. Every time the sound of his expensive leather shoes echoed on the marble floors, I found myself holding my breath, listening, a foolish part of me hoping he would pause at my door, say something, anything, to acknowledge my existence. He never did. It was Moon who offered the first glimmer of light in that cold, dark place. He began to thaw slowly, cautiously. One afternoon, I discovered him curled up in the window seat of the library, sketching intently on a pad with a single blue crayon. I approached quietly, kneeling beside him so as not to startle him. "That's a very nice drawing," I said softly. "Is that the garden?" He flinched, his big eyes darting up to me, full of hesitation. After a long moment he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first sound I had ever heard him make. The smile that broke across my face must have been blindingly huge, because a faint blush crept up his pale cheeks, and he quickly ducked his head back down to his drawing. "May I sit with you for a while?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. He didn't reply, but crucially, he didn't object. He didn't move away. So I sat, and for the next hour, we existed in a comfortable, shared silence. I worked on an article on my laptop while he filled the page with strange, wonderful shapes that seemed to follow a logic only he understood. When I finally closed my laptop, I saw that he had added a new element to his drawing of the garden. A small, stick-like figure with a wild scribble of hair stood beside a large, blue tree. "Is that you?" I asked, pointing. He shook his head, his dark hair flopping into his eyes. He pointed a small, crayon-stained finger at the figure. "That's you," he whispered, his voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the room. Something in my chest, a knot I didn't even know was there, loosened its grip. "Thank you, Moon." I reached out and ruffled his hair gently. He looked mortified, but he leaned into the touch for a fraction of a second before pulling away. Later that evening, I found the drawing placed carefully on the corner of my desk. It was the first gift I had received in this house, the first sign that I was not entirely invisible. Our small, silent routines became the anchor in my otherwise adrift existence. We'd have breakfast together, work side by side in the study, and sometimes I would help him with his coloring books. And every night, I would fall asleep alone in the vast, cold bed. It was a lonely life, but it had found its own quiet rhythm. Until the evening everything changed. I was in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes, when the front door slammed with a sound that reverberated through the entire house. Heavy, furious footsteps strode down the hall. "Where is he?" It was Parkman's voice, a low, dangerous growl laced with an unfamiliar urgency. The kitchen staff froze in place, a tableau of silent panic. One of the maids, her eyes wide with fear, pointed a trembling finger toward me. I turned just as he loomed in the doorway. He was a portrait of controlled chaos. His pristine white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his silk tie yanked loose. His hair was disheveled, and a muscle jumped in his tightly clenched jaw. He looked incandescent with a rage I couldn't begin to comprehend. "You didn't answer your phone," he stated, his voice flat and accusing. I blinked, bewildered. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. I was working. I called you 3 times. I must have been in the garden with Moon," I explained, a defensive edge creeping into my tone. "You should have informed someone of your whereabouts." A frown creased my brow. "Informed someone of what?" "That I was spending time with your son. In your garden?" The silence that followed was thick, electric. He stared at me, but this time it was different. He was truly looking at me, for what felt like the very first time. His gaze swept over my face, down to the ridiculous floral apron I was wearing, and then back up again. Something unreadable, a complex flicker of emotion, crossed his features. "I just Needed to know where you were, he said finally, his voice softer now, the anger seemingly extinguished. You've never cared before. The words slipped out, sharp and bitter, before I could stop them. His gaze darkened, but it wasn't with anger. It was something else, confusion, perhaps, even a shadow of guilt. Our standoff was broken by a small, hesitant voice. Appa? Parkman's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. He turned, and the hard lines of his face softened infinitesimally as he looked at Moon, who stood in the doorway, clutching his bear. Appa, Rakim cooked today, the boy announced shyly. He made fried rice. It was good. Parkman's eyes snapped back to mine, and a strange, unidentifiable emotion glimmered in their depths. You cooked? He asked, as if the concept were foreign. I shrugged, turning back to the sink. Someone had to. He didn't respond, but later, when dinner was served, he did something unprecedented. He sat down at the table. For the first time in all the months I had lived there, he joined us for a meal. He sat across from me, next to Moon, and though he said little, he ate slowly, thoughtfully. After dinner, Moon fell asleep on the sofa, his small head resting on my lap as I read a book. I looked up, a sixth sense telling me I was being watched. Parkman was standing in the shadows of the hallway, just observing us. Our eyes met for a long, breathless moment. That inscrutable expression was back, but it was softer this time, tinged with a sort of weary wonder, as if he was seeing a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. Without a word, he turned and walked away. But that night, when I entered my cold, empty bedroom, I found his jacket draped over the back of my desk chair. The very same charcoal gray jacket I had touched on my first day. The air was filled with its faint, familiar scent of cedar and dark coffee. It smelled like him, and that was how it started. The first hairline crack in his impenetrable armor. The first tentative spark of warmth in a house that had long forgotten what it felt like to be a home. I didn't know it then, but the frozen walls of Parkman's mansion were beginning to thaw. And perhaps, just maybe, so was his heart. Morning sunlight streamed into the living room, painting streaks of gold across the pale marble. Moon was seated cross-legged on the Persian rug, meticulously stacking colorful wooden blocks with a level of concentration only a 5-year-old can summon. I watched him from the sofa, a mug of coffee warming my hands, my laptop open but completely ignored. He had changed so much in the last few weeks. He was lighter, more present. He would initiate small conversations, his voice still soft but no longer hesitant. Just yesterday, he had asked me to read him a bedtime story, a request that felt as monumental as moving a mountain. Every small smile from him felt like a window being thrown open in this cold, sterile house, letting in a sliver of sunlight. Rakim, he said quietly, his focus still on his teetering tower of blocks. Can we bake cookies today? I blinked, feigning surprise. Cookies? Again? He nodded, a tiny, mischievous grin playing on his lips. You burned the last batch. Excuse me? I laughed, placing a hand over my heart in mock offense. That was not burning. That was artistic charring. It adds character. He giggled, a pure, tinkling sound that was still so new, so precious. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh with such uninhibited joy, and for a moment, I just sat there, soaking it in. It was incredible how the sound of one small child's laughter could somehow fill all the empty spaces in this enormous house. Our peaceful morning was interrupted by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Moon flinched, his body tensing slightly. I glanced out the window to see a sleek, black sedan pulling to a stop. "He's home," the boy whispered, instinctively shrinking back a little. It was Parkman. I hadn't seen him in 3 days. Each time he left on one of his business trips, I'd tell myself his absence was a relief, that I wouldn't even notice. But I always did. And now, watching him emerge from the car, impeccable in his crisp suit, phone pressed to his ear, his expression sharp and focused, I felt that familiar unwanted tightening in my chest. I hated that my body still reacted to his presence, that my heart still thumped a little faster after months of his calculated indifference. The front door opened and he strode inside. The atmosphere immediately dropped several degrees. Moon scurried closer to me on the rug, a subconscious move for comfort, and I found myself resting a reassuring hand on his small shoulder. Parkman's gaze swept the room and landed on us, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second too long. "You're home early," I said, my voice quiet. He loosened his tie, his attention already on a stack of mail. A meeting was cancelled. I turned back to my laptop, pretending to be absorbed in my work. "There's some soup on the stove if you're hungry." "I'm not hungry," he replied automatically. Of course he wasn't. He never was, not for anything I prepared. And yet, a minute later, I heard the faint clinking of a spoon against a ceramic bowl from the direction of the kitchen. I couldn't suppress the small, secret smile that touched my lips. That evening he didn't retreat to his study as he usually did. He lingered. He sat at the large dining table, ostensibly answering emails on his laptop, but I could feel his gaze on us as Moon and I embarked on our cookie-baking adventure. When Moon, in a fit of giggles, managed to get flour all over his hands and face, I instinctively reached for a dish towel and began gently wiping it away. From the corner of my eye, I saw Parkman's head lift. His expression softened for a fleeting moment before he quickly looked back down at his screen. But Moon had noticed. "Appa," he said, his voice small but determined. "Do you want to help?" Parkman froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. I held my breath, fully expecting him to dismiss the boy with a curt refusal, as he always had. But he didn't. After a long, charged pause, he slowly closed his laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet kitchen. He walked over, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small space. "I don't bake," he muttered, his voice rough. "That's okay," Moon chirped brightly. "You can be the mixer." I nearly dropped the bowl of dough. He stood beside me, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt, his expression carefully guarded. The three of us must have been a truly absurd sight. The formidable Alpha CEO, his once silent son, and the Omega husband he'd spent months ignoring, all standing shoulder to shoulder, dusted in a fine layer of flour. As he reached for the whisk, his hand brushed against mine. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm, and I forgot how to breathe for a second. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, his dark eyes flickering up to meet mine. "Sorry," he mumbled. "It's fine," I managed to say, my voice coming out as a whisper. Moon, blissfully unaware of the sudden tension, pointed at the lumpy dough. "Appa, you're doing it wrong," he laughed. And then it happened. For the first time since I had moved into this house, Parkman smiled. It wasn't a smirk or a polite curl of the lips. It was a small, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The sight of it struck me with an unexpected force, leaving me feeling breathless. Later that night, long after Moon had fallen asleep on the couch again, his belly full of slightly less charred cookies, I found myself watching Parkman's silhouette by the window. He was nursing a glass of wine, the distant city lights casting shifting patterns across his stoic face. "You've changed him," he said suddenly, his voice low and contemplative. I started. "Who? Moon?" He didn't turn around. "He talks now. He laughs. He used to go for days without making a sound." I swallowed, my gaze drifting to the sleeping child. He just needed someone to listen to him. He finally turned to meet my gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made it difficult to look away. The usual coldness was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that looked almost like regret. "And you listened." "He's a good kid," I said softly. "You should try spending more time with him." He looked down into his wine glass, swirling the dark liquid. "I'm trying." "That's good." We stood in silence for a while, the space between us charged with all the words we had never spoken. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear him, he asked, "Are you happy here?" I froze. Of all the questions I could have imagined him asking, that was not one of them. "I'm fine," I lied, the word feeling flimsy and inadequate. He nodded slowly, his gaze so perceptive it felt like he could see right through my flimsy deception. Then, before I could process what was happening, he reached out and gently brushed something from my hair. It was a tiny smudge of flour I had missed. His fingers lingered for a second longer than necessary, the brief contact sending a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched in my throat. He withdrew his hand quickly, as if realizing his transgression. "Good night," he murmured, and just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room. But this time, when the door closed behind him, my heart didn't feel quite so cold. In the days that followed, the small changes became more frequent, more deliberate. He started coming home earlier. He would ask if I had eaten. Sometimes, he would linger in the doorway of Moon's room while I read bedtime stories, his expression unreadable but no longer dismissive. One evening, I returned late from the grocery store to find him on the living room couch with Moon fast asleep on his lap. His tie was undone, his hair was a mess, and his eyes, when they lifted to meet mine, looked utterly exhausted, but softer than I had ever seen them. "He waited up for you," Parkman said quietly. "He wouldn't go to sleep until you came back." Something warm and painful twisted in my chest. "You stayed with him?" He nodded, his gaze dropping back to his sleeping son. I didn't want him to think I would leave too. The word "too" hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I didn't ask what he meant. I wanted to reach out, to thank him, perhaps even to touch his hand, but I couldn't bring myself to cross the invisible line that still separated us. Felt too fragile, too new. Instead, I just whispered, "Thank you." He looked at me for a long moment before replying, his voice low. "You don't have to thank me for being his father." But we both knew that wasn't what I was thanking him for. The following week, the housekeeper mentioned in a hushed tone that the entire staff had noticed a change in the mansion's atmosphere. I laughed it off, but she was right. There was a warmth now, a faint, hesitant glow in the corners of the house that had once been so cold. And then one night it all came to a head. I was working late in the study, my eyes burning from staring at the screen, when the door creaked open. Parkman stood there, still dressed in his work slacks and shirt, the top buttons undone. "You should be asleep," he said. "I'm just finishing," and I replied, not looking up. He stepped further into the room, his presence filling the space. "You've been staring at that screen for hours. Work helps me think." A faint curve touched his lips. "You're stubborn." I finally looked up, ready with a sharp retort. And you're... My words died in my throat when I realized just how close he was. He was leaning against the desk, the faint, intoxicating scent of cedar and coffee wrapping around me. His hand rested on the polished wood beside mine. His body angled towards me just enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from him. For a long, charged moment, neither of us moved or spoke. Then, his voice dropped to a near whisper, sending a tremor through me. You really don't care, do you? What? Whether I come home or not? His eyes searched mine, looking for something I didn't know how to give. You used to wait up. I swallowed hard. That was months ago. And now? Now, I said, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. I've stopped expecting anything at all. The silence that followed was electric. I saw a muscle tighten in his jaw, then relax. A flicker of something that looked devastatingly like pain crossed his face before he masked it. Good, he said finally, though his tone was anything but. Perhaps that's better for both of us. He turned to leave, but he paused at the door, his back to me. Still, he said, without looking back, don't stay up too late. When he was gone, my pulse was still thundering in my ears. But it wasn't from anger this time. It was from something far more terrifying, far more dangerous. That night I dreamed of him. I dreamed of his hand brushing mine, of his eyes softening, of the sound of Moon's laughter echoing in the space between us. And when I woke up, my heart pounding against my ribs, I was forced to confront a terrifying truth. Against all logic, against all my efforts to protect myself, I was falling for him. It had to have been a trick of the light, I told myself. The way Parkman's gaze seemed to follow me across a room when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his voice, usually so clipped and formal, would soften imperceptibly whenever Moon laughed in my presence. The way the silences between us had gradually transformed from a form of punishment into a question, hanging in the air, waiting for an answer. I wasn't supposed to notice these things. My role was simple. Keep my head down, do my work, and never forget that this marriage was a business contract, not a fairy tale. But hearts, I was learning, have a tendency to ignore the fine print. The next morning I woke before the sun. The house was still, bathed in the soft, gray light of dawn. I went downstairs to the kitchen, needing the ritual of making coffee to clear the jumble of thoughts in my head. I nearly jumped out of my skin when a low voice spoke from the shadows behind me. You always wake up this early. I whirled around. Parkman was leaning against the kitchen entryway, dressed not in his usual armor of a bespoke suit, but in simple gray sweatpants and a black hoodie, his hair still damp from a shower. It was the first time I'd ever seen him so casual, so ordinary, and yet the sight made my pulse do a frantic little dance. I couldn't sleep, I admitted, turning back to the coffee machine. He nodded, moving to stand on the other side of the counter. Neither could I. The air between us was thick with the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans and the clean scent of his soap. He reached for a mug at the exact same moment I did. Our fingers brushed. A small, fleeting contact, but the spark it sent through me was anything but. It was the kind of shock that travels straight to your heart. This time he didn't pull away immediately. You take it black with far too much sugar, I said, the observation slipping out before I could think. The corner of his mouth curved upwards, not quite a smile, but close. Figures. What's that supposed to mean? That you're too sweet for bitter things, he replied. It could have been a careless remark, but there was an undercurrent in his tone, half teasing, half sincere, that left me utterly defenseless. Later that day, I took Moon to a park near his kindergarten. I sat on a bench, trying to an article on my phone, while he happily chased pigeons across the grass. A few of the other parents recognized me from school drop-offs. One of them, a young alpha journalist I'd occasionally collaborated with online, stopped to chat. "Rakim, I didn't expect to see you here," he said with a friendly, easy smile. It was nothing more than a polite conversation. But just then, Parkman's black sedan pulled up to the curb. "Appa!" Moon shouted with delight, abandoning the pigeons and running towards him. Parkman's gaze flickered from the journalist to me and back again. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes was as sharp and cold as shattered glass. As soon as the other man had made a hasty departure, Parkman walked over, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his trousers. "An old friend?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "A colleague," I replied, my attention fixed on Moon. "He's the oar for the culture section. He seems comfortable with you." I finally turned to face him, my patience wearing thin. "Is that a problem?" He met my gaze, his own unblinking. "No," he said, but the word felt like a lie. For a tense moment, neither of us spoke. Then he let out a long, slow sigh, and some of the rigidity left his shoulders. "You have a life outside of this house," he said, his voice quieter. "I forget that sometimes. Because you're barely in it to see it," I thought, but I didn't say it. He looked down, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. Because I barely let myself look. Something fluttered in my chest. Felt dangerously like hope. That evening, a storm rolled in over the city, the sky turning a bruised purple. Moon was already fast asleep when the first drops of rain began to fall, quickly turning into a torrential downpour. I stood on the covered balcony off the living room, watching the water trace frantic, silver lines down the glass. I heard footsteps approach from behind me. "You'll catch a cold out here," Parkman said softly. I liked the sound of the rain. He came to stand beside me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cool night air. "So do I," he admitted. We stood there in a comfortable silence for a while, just listening to the rhythm of the storm. Then he spoke again, his voice so low it was almost part of the rain itself. "I used to think that quiet was peaceful, but lately, the quiet just feels empty when you're not in it." My breath caught in my throat. "Parkman," he gently took my shoulders and turned me until we were face to face. His expression was a tumultuous sea of emotions I couldn't decipher, but his eyes, for the first time, were filled with an undeniable warmth. It was here, in this moment, that he asked the question that changed everything. "Tell me something, Rakim Wu. If I'd been different from the start, if I'd tried, would you have tried too?" I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You didn't want me to," I whispered. "I was afraid to." His voice cracked, barely audible over the sound of the rain. "I didn't know how to love anyone without breaking them." I searched his face, seeing not the powerful CEO, but a man who was just as lost and lonely as I was. "And now I'm afraid it's too late." He lifted a hand, but hesitated midway, as if asking for permission. I didn't move, couldn't. His fingers, when they finally brushed against my cheek, were tentative, almost reverent. The scent of rain and cedar enveloped us, creating a small, intimate world on the stormy balcony. And for the first time since our wedding day, I didn't feel like an intruder in his home. "I don't know what this means yet," I whispered, my voice trembling. Then let's find out, he murmured. The clap of thunder outside filled the silence that followed. He leaned in, and when his forehead rested against mine, it wasn't a kiss. It was something more profound. It was a promise, fragile and real and terrifying. Later that night, I sat by Moon's bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. The world felt different, lighter, even though nothing tangible had changed. Parkman passed by the open doorway, paused, and offered me a faint, hesitant smile before switching off the hall light. "Good night," he murmured. I watched his silhouette disappear down the corridor, my heart beating a frantic, hopeful rhythm in the quiet house. Maybe it was foolish to hope. Maybe I would wake up tomorrow and he would be cold and distant again. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that something beautiful was finally melting beneath all that ice.